My ranch sits on land my father bought many years ago. Back then, it was just a small house and a single barn with simple fences. Over time, the place grew. A few pens, a shed for tools, a feed storage building, and a bit of machinery were added. When my father passed, it all came to me. I grew up here, learned his habits and his way of running things. Now everything feels familiar. The barn, the well, the distances between the buildings and the pastures. I keep the livestock at a manageable number. Cattle, a few horses, and a handful of sheep. Everything is under control. Water, feed, veterinary care, upkeep. The livestock provides meat, milk, and wool. The money from sales and deliveries covers the workers' wages, feed purchases, and maintenance. I aim for balance, not unchecked growth. That way, it's easier to maintain quality and avoid losing money to unnecessary expenses. Next to the house is a shed with tools. Inside, you'll find hammers, nails, saws, wire, spare parts for the tractor, and fuel. Everything is stored neatly. I don't like wasting time hunting for something. Order saves time, and the workers appreciate that. Lucas handles the fences. He knows how to reinforce them. He's a man of few words, but he understands the job without needing much explanation. Jim oversees the hay, feed, and loading. Enrique takes care of the horses, cleaning, tending to their hooves. The horses are our backup when machinery fails. The workers show up at the agreed time, do their jobs, and don't waste words. It keeps things simple. The barn isn't far from the house. Inside are hay, sacks of grain, tools, wire, planks, and nails. I always know where everything is. If I need to feed the livestock or load a shipment, it's all within reach. There's a tractor, an old one, but it still runs. I check the oil, hoses, and plan repairs ahead of time. It's a habit I learned as a kid. My father always said to never put off small tasks. The surrounding area is quiet. Pastures, low hills, groves, and beyond that, the woods. I don't go into the woods without a reason. Water comes from wells, and I collect rainwater for the garden. I grow a few rows of potatoes, carrots, and onions, just enough for myself. It saves money and gives me a sense of independence. There's no need for a huge garden. Keeping it small makes it easier to manage. Other ranches are scattered around the area. My neighbor Pete lives to the west. Sometimes he stops by to discuss grain, cattle prices, or deliveries. He lets me know when buyers are coming. I share what I know in return. These conversations save us trips into town. Knowing when supplies will be available means we can plan ahead, saving time, money, and effort. The workers live nearby. They come in the morning, work until evening, then head home to their families. I don't keep them longer than necessary. They do their jobs, I pay them. If problems arise, we solve them without fuss. Stability is key. Livestock won't wait for an argument to end. It needs feeding, watering, and care every day. The vet comes when I call, vaccinations, health checks, whatever's needed. I don't let diseases spread. Healthy cattle mean better milk and meat. Healthy horses are ready to work when needed. I sell the products to buyers under clear terms, price, deadlines, quality. Disputes are rare. Deliveries are on time, and I keep some of the products for myself: milk, butter, cream, meat. Processing is done right here with the help of the workers. By the porch lies my old dog, Troy. He's not young anymore, doesn't run much, but if someone unfamiliar shows up, he lets me know. That's enough of a warning for me. One dog is all I need. Troy is used to the routine and sometimes accompanies me when I check the property. I inspect the tools in the shed from time to time. If a saw gets rusty, I clean it right away. If I'm running low on nails, I note it down in my notebook and buy more the next time I'm in town. The same goes for fuel, spare parts, and wire. A clear list saves me from scrambling later. Everything stays under control. The garden behind the house is modest. Potatoes, carrots, onions, a bit of lettuce. It doesn't require much effort. I water it with rainwater. In dry years, I water more often. In wet years, it's even easier. It's low maintenance, and that suits me fine. Sometimes relatives or old friends of my father visit, staying a day or two. I offer them what I have, and they tell me about their lives. I'm not always interested, but keeping family ties is important. They know the history of this land, and I know their stories. Family matters, even if they live in other states. Feed suppliers come by arrangement. If the hay harvest is weak, I line up deliveries ahead of time. That way, I'm never caught without enough to feed the livestock. I like to plan a month or more in advance. It avoids last-minute scrambles for grain when prices are high. The house is simple, just a couple of rooms, a kitchen, a pantry stocked with supplies, and some photographs. It's not luxurious, but I don't need luxury. Reliability and practicality are what matter. When it's time to eat, I cook. When it's time to clean, I do it right away. In the evenings, I might sit down to look through agricultural machinery catalogs, check the accounts, or plan expenses for the next week or month. Jim sometimes asks about expanding the ranch, but I explain that stability is more important to me. More livestock means more risks, expenses, and headaches. I'm content with what I have. Expanding would bring labor shortages or feed supply issues, and I'd rather avoid that. When evening comes, the workers finish up, put away their tools, and head home. I might walk around the barn, check the shed, make sure everything's in its place. Then I sit on the porch and think about tomorrow, whether I should repair part of the fence or buy more hay if a drought is forecasted. These moments help me stay organized. Pete promised to stop by this week to discuss grain or cattle prices. I don't mind. We usually come to an agreement quickly and without fuss. He's a practical man, like me. In our line of work, there's no room for empty promises. It's about making a deal and following through. Everything on the ranch is kept in good shape. Spot a problem? Fix it. There are tools, and the workers know their craft. They'll repair, reinforce, replace a plank, or straighten the gates. That's how we avoid unpleasant surprises. And so the days pass on my ranch, tending to livestock, repairs, planning, trading, talking with neighbors and workers. It's all built on a foundation of knowing our duties and being honest about the work. I don't look for change without reason. What I have is enough to support myself, pay my people, and keep the ranch running. That's the kind of order I like. I woke up as usual. Nothing disturbed the familiar rhythm of my morning. Stepping out onto the porch, I scanned the view, house, barn, shed, pens. Everything was as it should be. The workers hadn't arrived yet. I made my way toward the pasture. The cows grazed peacefully. The fence wires were taut, no issues in sight. The horses were still in their enclosure. Enrique would be here later. I stopped by the tool shed. Everything was in order. Boxes closed, parts where they belonged. I rinsed my hands with water from the barrel and headed to the barn. Inside, the hay bales, grain sacks, rolls of wire, and fuel cans were all neatly arranged. It looked just as it had yesterday. I heard footsteps. Lucas had arrived on time. He nodded at me and got to work on the fences. Jim and Enrique would show up later, each to their own tasks. There were no water issues today. The wells were full, and the barrels weren't running low. Back in the house, I looked over my list of tasks. Pete was due to stop by soon to discuss a grain shipment. I calculated the prices carefully. I didn't want to let him down. Our relationship was built on trust. Not long after, I saw Jim heading to the barn for tools. I asked him to check the far pen, where I'd noticed some sagging yesterday. He nodded, no questions asked. I appreciated his no-nonsense attitude. Enrique arrived and opened the enclosure for the horses. He checked their feed troughs, his movements steady and practiced. The horses were calm. They knew him and he knew them. It was all predictable, clear. I watched them work without stepping in. If something went wrong, they'd let me know. Later in the morning, a truck pulled up with a delivery of feed. The driver was someone I knew, and he'd brought exactly what was promised. I checked the quality. It was fine. We settled the payment quickly. No need for small talk. That's how it works out here, straightforward and efficient. I trusted the supplier, and he hadn't let me down. The day moved at its usual steady pace. Lucas inspected the fences, Jim stacked hay bales, and Enrique busied himself with the horses. I walked the property, assessing whether anything needed repairs. I checked the shed and the tools. Everything was as it should be. Troy lay near the porch, not even bothering to get up. There was no reason for alarm. I didn't dwell on changes. Things were moving along as they always had. Sometimes I'd chat with the workers. Lucas mentioned needing to shore up the soil around one of the fence posts. I jotted it down in my notebook so I wouldn't forget. The garden didn't need tending today. We'd recently weeded and watered the rows. I'd check again in a few days, but for now there was no need. By evening the workers had finished their tasks. I made one last round of the pens and checked on the livestock. The cows and horses were calm. I could finally sit down, look over my paperwork, and think about what needed doing next. Maybe I'd make a trip to town for spare parts if anything started to show wear. For now, everything was fine, but it was always better to stay prepared. The hay and grain stores were well stocked. The weather was stable. No droughts or heavy rains forecasted. The grass was growing, and the animals were well fed. Everything felt predictable and manageable. Before bed, I cleared the paperwork off the table and put my notebook and pen in the drawer. In the morning, I wouldn't have to search for them. If someone came by with business to discuss, I'd be ready. The next morning felt just like the last. I got up, checked the pastures, and took in the crisp air. The workers arrived as usual. Lucas headed to the pens. Jim took care of the hay, and Enrique tended to the horses. I walked around the yard and shed. Everything was in place. As I started back toward the house to plan the day's tasks, I noticed something strange. The visibility was dropping. At first I thought it was just ground mist rising, but it wasn't warm enough yet for that kind of haze. On the edge of the property, a dense layer of fog hung in the air, unlike anything I'd seen before. I moved closer to the fence. The far-off cows looked blurred. Their breathing sounded muffled. I called for Lucas, and he came over, frowning but silent. Jim and Enrique had noticed it too. What should have been a light morning mist was growing thicker, creeping toward the main buildings. I didn't panic. I grabbed my binoculars and climbed onto the porch, but the fog swallowed everything. Light seemed to vanish in it. Troy, my dog, let out a low, confused sound as if he couldn't make sense of it either. Minutes turned into hours, and the fog didn't lift. It deepened. I asked Jim to check on the cattle farther out. He took a few steps but quickly returned, saying visibility dropped sharply after only a short distance. Lucas suggested herding the livestock closer to the house. We managed to bring some of the cows in, but the rest were lost in the gray void. The horses were skittish, snorting and refusing to come near the fence. Normally, any morning haze would burn off by noon, but not today. The fog blanketed the property, and everyone moved cautiously. I thought about venturing out farther, but realized I could lose my way on my own land. I tried the radio, nothing but static. Driving to Pete's place was out of the question. I'd likely run into a tree before finding the road. By midday, one of the cows went missing. Enrique and Jim tied a rope to the porch post and ventured out to look for it. They returned empty-handed and shaken, saying the usual landmarks had disappeared, and the fog seemed to swallow up sounds and smells, leaving them disoriented. The livestock grew restless. The cows huddled together, and the horses acted strangely, as if sensing danger. Troy stuck close to the porch, pacing in uneasy circles. I checked the radio again, but the static persisted. As evening came, things only got worse. We lit lamps, but the light was swallowed by the thick mist. The floodlights and flashlights were useless. Their beams dissipated without effect. We hadn't kept torches on hand. There had never been a need. But now it was clear that electric light wouldn't help us. By nightfall, the fog was oppressive, consuming sound, shapes, and all familiar points of reference. The usual rustling of the woods and the chirping of birds were gone. We decided to stay together in the house. The workers didn't leave. There was no way they could make it home in this. Inside, we lit more lamps, but outside, the light barely extended past the windows. We talked about trying to drive out in the morning, but without visibility, it would be too risky. Enrique mentioned the horses refused to step into the fog. Jim suggested waiting it out, hoping it would clear on its own. There weren't many options. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stepped onto the porch with a kerosene lamp. The light disappeared a few steps away. Troy sat beside me, growling softly. In the distance, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound, but it was impossible to tell. Nothing became clearer, and I had no choice but to head back inside. By morning, the fog had grown even denser, a solid wall around us. Jim and I tried to check on the livestock nearby. We took only a few steps from the house before realizing we could barely make out the fence. Going further was pointless. Enrique offered to try reaching the second shed. We agreed, tying a long rope to the doorframe to guide him back. The plan was simple. Some of us would stay inside while the rest ventured out. I reminded everyone of the danger. Visibility was non-existent, and we didn't know what had attacked Enrique or chased Pete and his family. As we discussed, Pete's family, his neighbors really, tried not to interrupt, but their faces betrayed their fear. No one understood the nature of this phenomenon. The women clung to their children, whispering reassurances that everything would be fine. But even we didn't know if that was true. I suggested we take things step by step. First, we needed more torches. I fetched rags and kerosene. Jim and Lucas started wrapping the rags around poles while Enrique held a candle for light. Pete and his sons pitched in. The boys were strong and quick, expertly securing the fabric. Within half an hour, we had about a dozen torches ready. Next, we planned our outing. The first goal was to reach the barn, which wasn't far. We needed to check on the livestock and see if we could gather tools or anything useful. I also thought we might build a small fire midway between the house and barn as a beacon of light. But for that, we'd need firewood. Pete pointed out that I must have firewood for the stove. I nodded. It was stored in the wood pile around the corner of the house. The problem was getting there. The fog would make it risky, but with the torches we might manage. We decided I'd go with Pete, his eldest son, Lucas, and Enrique. Jim and the rest would stay inside to look after the families. We stepped outside, lighting the torches as we went. Their flames provided just enough light to make out the house, the walls, and the ground beneath our feet. But anything beyond a few steps disappeared into the murky white void. We formed a chain. I led, Pete followed, then his son, with Lucas and Enrique bringing up the rear. We kept visual contact only thanks to the torches. Step by step, we reached the corner of the house. The woodpile was under a simple lean-to, stacked with split logs. I reached out and felt the support post. Visibility was terrible. Leaning down, I began picking up firewood, and Pete and his son did the same. Lucas and Enrique stood guard, holding the torches and scanning the fog. Suddenly, Enrique let out a muffled yelp. He said something had moved to his left. We all turned, but there was nothing to see, just the fog. Pete raised his torch higher, but no shapes emerged. I said we needed to head back. As we took the first steps toward the house, a faint crackling sound came from behind us. It felt like someone, or something, was moving nearby, but we saw no one. We quickened our pace, reaching the door where Jim was waiting to let us in. We dragged the firewood inside. Pete's daughters-in-law asked if everything was all right. I reassured them as calmly as I could, saying we had the firewood. Lighting another torch from the ones already burning, I considered how to start a fire safely. Doing it inside the house was too dangerous. There wasn't enough space. But stepping outside risked losing the wood to the fog. Lucas suggested building a fire directly on the porch, but I worried it could endanger the house. Then I remembered a metal lid from an old barrel in the shed. If we could retrieve it, we could build a fire on the lid, keeping it contained and safe. But the shed was in the opposite direction. While we debated, Pete asked if I'd had any contact with the outside world. I showed him the radio. He turned it on, but there was nothing but static. That meant interference or simply no broadcasts. We had no idea how far the fog had spread. Maybe the entire area was blanketed. Maybe no one could help. Pete's kids began asking for food. I went to the pantry and pulled out some supplies, crackers, a bit of bread. I had some canned goods too, but it was better to save those for later. I handed out the food, and the adults ate sparingly, knowing our supplies weren't endless. Pete mentioned there might have been food in their truck, but the truck was lost in the fog, and no one was willing to risk going after it. His sons offered to help, but their wives protested, insisting they stay. I reminded everyone that we couldn't sit idle for long. If the fog didn't clear on its own, we'd eventually run out of supplies. We needed to figure out what was happening and find a way out. Perhaps we could wait until night to see if anything changed, but last night had offered no answers. While we talked, a faint crunch came from outside the door. Grabbing a torch, I stepped forward. Pete armed himself with a stick, and Lucas picked up the hatchet. We opened the door and extended the torch into the fog. Nothing was visible. Inside, Pete's children began crying again, and the women pulled them closer. Enrique stood by the window, listening intently, while Jim held a second torch. We all knew we weren't alone. Something was out there, waiting for us to slip up. The only thing we could do was hope that with fire and determination, we could hold the ranch. But no one knew for how long. That night, we stayed in the house, careful not to make unnecessary noise. The fire burning in a bucket on the porch was kept alive, with someone adding fuel whenever it grew low. The fog remained just as dense, and strange sounds, footsteps, creaks, and crackles, echoed beyond the door. No one could explain what we were hearing. Inside, people huddled close together. The children cried softly, and the women held them tight. The men clutched whatever they could use as weapons: sticks, torches, kitchen knives. I knew we were vulnerable without real weapons. The floodlights, flashlights, even lanterns, all of them were useless. The fog swallowed their beams within a few steps. By the flickering light of the torches, I checked my watch. It was well past midnight, but none of us could sleep. Whispering, we decided to check the barn in the morning. There might be tools or metal bars we could use. Pete mentioned the shotgun in his truck again, but no one knew which direction to search. Venturing out without a clear destination would be suicide. As dawn broke, we decided to check on the animals. We couldn't risk it, but leaving the livestock shut in without knowing their condition wasn't an option either. Pete, his eldest son, Lucas and I stepped outside while the others stayed behind. We lit several torches and armed ourselves with sticks. We moved slowly, keeping in a tight line. I led, followed by Pete, then his son, with Lucas bringing up the rear. The barn was only a few dozen steps away, but it felt like miles. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it seemed even thicker. Finally, we found the fence by touch and used it to guide us. Carefully, we reached the barn doors. I pushed one open, and it creaked loudly. Inside was near total darkness. We brought the torches in, and a sharp smell hit us. Not the usual scent of hay, but something harsher, heavier. I stepped forward, raising the torch. The light revealed faint shapes on the ground. Moving closer, I saw a cow lying still. It wasn't moving. Pete stepped to the side. His son let out a startled cry as he got a good look at the animal. The cow appeared to have been torn apart. Its rib cage was exposed, and some of its internal organs were missing. Blood had soaked into the hay beneath it. Another cow lay nearby in the same state. We backed away. Lucas clenched his fists. Pete cursed under his breath, and his son turned pale. While we'd been huddled in the house, the livestock had been left unprotected. Something, or someone, had gotten into the barn. There had been no sounds of distress, no struggle. It was clear now. The fog didn't just obscure sight, it also muffled sound. Whatever these creatures were, they hunted quietly and with precision. We now knew for certain that we weren't dealing with shadows or strange noises. There were real predators out there. It became painfully clear we couldn't hold out like this for long. If they could take down cows, they could just as easily attack people. We stood there, unsure of what to do next. Should we try to save the remaining animals? But where were they now? We'd herded some closer to the house yesterday, but the fog could have scattered them. Should we check on the horses in their pen? It was dangerous, but it needed to be done. Leaving the grisly scene in the barn behind, we made our way toward the horse enclosure, careful not to lose our sense of direction. We kept in a tight line. The torches flickered, their flames unsteady but still burning. Did we hear something out there? Occasionally it felt like a faint rustling came from the sides, but the distance was impossible to judge. We reached the fence, feeling our way forward. Horses usually respond to the sound of human voices, but this time there was silence. I raised my torch, but all I saw beyond the fence was the murky white void. Pete called out the horses by name, but there was no response. We considered going inside the pen, but it could have been a trap. Maybe the horses had bolted if something had scared them. Had they broken through the fence? We felt along the edges and found one section where the boards were loose. It seemed like the horses had forced their way out. Not wanting to risk venturing further, we returned to the house and told the others what we'd found. When we shared the news about the dead cows, the women gasped and the children began to cry. Pete sank into a chair, burying his head in his hands. Lucas stood against the wall, scowling, while Jim and Enrique let out heavy sighs. I tried to keep calm, but I knew we were trapped. We made another attempt to contact the outside world. I turned the radio dial, searching for a signal. Nothing but static. Trying to make a phone call was equally fruitless. Pete asked if a landline might work, but there wasn't even a dial tone. Either the lines were dead, or the interference was too strong. It was clear we were completely cut off. If the fog had spread to other ranches, they were likely in trouble too, and wouldn't be able to help us. If it was localized, maybe someone was already trying to reach us, but we had no way of knowing. Either way, we were on our own. Pete's children kept crying. His daughters-in-law begged him to do something, asked for weapons, pleaded to flee to town. Pete shook his head and said leaving was impossible. Without visibility, there was no way to find the road. They could crash into a tree, fall into a ditch, or simply get lost. And then there were the creatures in the fog. We made a few more torches. There was still some kerosene left, but not enough to last forever. The water tank for the livestock was still usable, but supplies were finite. The food we had was limited, and if the fog lasted much longer, hunger would become a new problem. The livestock couldn't be protected anymore. Many had likely run off or been killed. Tensions were rising. Some of Pete's family members began arguing. The women were frustrated by the inaction, while Pete's sons suggested risking a search for their truck to retrieve the shotgun. I argued that it was too dangerous. Without a clear plan, they might not return. Lucas and Jim backed me up. Enrique stayed silent, clearly still haunted by the scratch he'd received the day before. While we debated, I paused to listen. It was quiet outside. I stepped onto the porch with a torch and looked around. The light barely illuminated the ground a few steps ahead. The firewood in the bucket had burned down to embers, so I added a few more logs, poured kerosene over them, and reignited the flames. The fire flared up, lighting the porch and a small patch of ground beyond. I didn't hear or see anything, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. These creatures, whatever they were, moved stealthily. I went back inside and reported that everything seemed quiet for now. Pete suggested we barricade the doors and windows. We moved a cabinet and some tables to block the doors and draped blankets over the windows to hide the light from within. It probably wouldn't stop the creatures if they decided to break in, but it might slow them down. At least that was Pete's hope. Later, Jim proposed using a long rope for reconnaissance. By tying it to the porch, we could move out and still find our way back. We'd tried something similar before, but now we knew the danger was real. If we could reach Pete's truck and retrieve the shotgun, our chances of survival might improve. I pointed out that a shotgun was no guarantee, but it was better than a stick or hatchet against predators. We debated who would go. Pete wanted to go himself with one of his sons. I insisted that only 2, or at most 3, should go to minimize the risk of losing too many people if something went wrong. Lucas volunteered to help. We postponed the decision until morning, hoping the fog might lift, but as time passed, nothing changed. The children asked for food again. We gave them some dry biscuits. Thankfully, we still had some canned goods, but not many. We'd have to ration them carefully. We didn't know how long this situation would last. If the fog stayed for days, it would be catastrophic. I thought about making a signal fire, something large enough to be seen from a distance. But for that, we'd need to venture off the porch, find a safe spot, and gather enough wood. In zero visibility, that seemed almost impossible. Then came a sound. It was faint, but unmistakable, a low, guttural growl from beyond the wall. Everyone fell silent. I stepped to the door, listening. Nothing more came, but the tension in the room was palpable. Pete nodded grimly, showing he'd heard it too. His sons gripped their sticks tightly, and the women held the children close. One of my workers began whispering a prayer under his breath. Time dragged on. I knew the situation was critical. We'd lost livestock, had no contact with the outside world, and were surrounded by fog. Predators lurked within it, silent and deadly, tearing apart animals with ease. Inside the house, we had people of all ages, limited resources, and no proper weapons. By evening, we decided to set up a small barricade near the porch and place 2 or 3 torches nearby. The idea was to create a lit perimeter just outside. If we could hold even a small area of visibility, it might give us the courage to push further. But going outside was still a risk. The fire might repel the creatures, or it might attract them. Either way, without fire, we were defenseless. Pete asked me if there had ever been fogs like this before. I told him no. The weather here was usually calm, and I'd never seen anything like this. This wasn't ordinary fog. It was strange, dense, unmoving, unaffected by the sun. It refused to lift, almost as if it were alive. Pete nodded grimly. I noticed the air carried a more putrid smell now. Maybe it was from the decomposing animal carcasses in the barn or somewhere else nearby. The stench only heightened the unease. If predators were actively hunting, it meant they weren't planning to leave any time soon. Late that night, we heard a new sound, something scratching against the side of the house. I grabbed a torch and held it near the window, but the blanket covering it blocked any view. The scratching stopped. We decided not to investigate. If they were testing us, probing for weaknesses, we needed to stay vigilant. Thus ended another grueling night, surrounded by fog and unseen enemies. It was clear we needed to make decisions. Search for Pete's truck, find the shotgun, and expand the area of light. Otherwise, we'd just be sitting ducks, waiting for them to come for us. Morning brought no relief. The fog remained as thick as ever, its dense white shroud barely letting light through. We sat in the house, straining to hear any sounds beyond the walls. By now, we had no doubt predators were out there. They'd already demonstrated their power by taking down the livestock. It was only a matter of time before they tried to get closer to us. Pete's children woke up restless and hungry. I handed out a few crackers and a sip of water. Supplies were dwindling fast. We couldn't keep feeding 12 people without resupply or access to resources. The adults whispered among themselves. We needed to act. A dangerous thought came to mind, finding Pete's truck and retrieving the shotgun. Without a weapon, we were utterly defenseless. I assembled a small group. Pete, his eldest son, and Lucas. We decided to take the risk. First, we would try to expand the lit area around the porch. The bucket of burning firewood provided little light. If we could set up a few torches or even build a small fire just outside, we might see farther. The fog muted most light, but it was worth a shot. We discussed the plan and gathered a few torches, rags, kerosene, and a long rope. I tied the rope to the porch post. The idea was to venture a short distance, set up the metal lid from an old barrel as a fire base, and build a small fire. It would serve as a beacon. If we managed to create even a chain of 2 or 3 such light points, we might carve a path toward where the truck was parked. I remembered that one of the sheds contained an old metal barrel lid. Finding the shed in this fog would be difficult, but we had to try. Jim and Enrique stayed behind to watch over the others and prepare additional torches in case we needed them when we returned. We stepped onto the porch. I led with a torch. Pete followed with firewood. His son carried more wood and a bottle of kerosene. And Lucas handled the rope, feeding it out behind us to mark the way back. We took a few steps away from the house. The fog swallowed everything. Visibility was non-existent. The torch cast a dim orange glow, barely piercing the milky haze. We reached a patch of flat ground and placed the firewood there. Pete poured kerosene over the wood and I lit it. The fire burst to life, roaring brightly, but the surrounding fog remained oppressive. The light pushed it back slightly, but not by much. Leaving the fire burning, we moved further along the rope toward our next goal. I felt my way forward with my feet, hesitant with every step. After a while, Lucas muttered that we'd gone a fair distance but still hadn't found the shed. Pete tried to reorient us, saying the shed should be slightly to the right of the house, but without visibility it was impossible to be sure. Then we heard a rustling sound to one side. We froze. I raised the torch. Pete tensed. His son swallowed hard, and Lucas strained to see through the fog. The rustling came again. It felt like something was circling us. I crouched, lifting the torch higher. Nothing. We decided not to linger and made our way back toward the fire beacon. But as we turned, a low growl reached our ears. The air felt colder, almost biting. We hurried back along the rope to the fire. The flames were still burning, casting their faint light. We attempted to stretch the rope in a different direction, hoping to find any kind of metal surface for another fire base. But the sounds returned. This time, we heard distinct footsteps, followed by a splash, as if something heavy had stepped into a puddle. But there were no puddles here. The sound must have been distorted by the fog. Realizing the risk was too great, we decided to return to the house. We'd found nothing useful and didn't want to push our luck further. As we turned to leave, the fire behind us hissed loudly, as if someone had doused it with water. We spun around to see the flames dying, shrinking rapidly. It was as if the fog itself had extinguished the fire or something unseen had smothered it with wet earth. In an instant, the light was gone, leaving us in near total darkness again. Without light, we were vulnerable prey. Back to the house now, I shouted, yanking the rope to signal the way. We rushed back, holding onto the line and gripping our torches tightly. Suddenly, Pete stumbled and cried out. I raised the torch to see what had tripped him. On the ground lay a piece of animal hide, likely part of a cow or horse, torn and discarded. Were the predators bringing their kills closer to the house? We didn't know. We scrambled back onto the porch and pounded on the door. Jim let us in and we tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. Pete's son was pale as a sheet. Lucas wiped sweat from his face and Pete stood silently, his jaw clenched. I explained to the others that the plan had failed. We hadn't found the metal lid or anything else for a larger fire, and the flames we'd managed to build had been mysteriously extinguished. The situation was growing dire. We couldn't expand the lighted area, couldn't locate the truck, and couldn't get to the shotgun. The predators seemed to be reacting to our efforts, asserting their dominance. They hadn't attacked us directly, but they were sending a clear message. This was their territory. The children cried again, and the women began lamenting the hopelessness of our situation. Pete raised a hand to silence them, speaking softly but firmly. Everyone understood that panic wouldn't help. I called for quiet and told everyone we needed to think of the next steps. Jim suggested trying to create a signal flare using improvised tools, but I didn't have gunpowder or the materials for such a device. Enrique proposed making loud noises to scare off the creatures, but noise hadn't helped so far. If anything, it might draw them closer. The room fell silent again as we wrestled with the growing realization. We were running out of time and options. We had draped blankets over the windows, but Jim lifted one corner and held up a torch. Beyond the thick layer of fog, there was nothing to see. The sound came again, like something heavy and soft hitting the ground near the wall. I motioned for him to step away from the window. After several tense seconds, the now familiar scraping returned, louder this time, sharper. It lasted longer than before, as though something was trying to dig its claws into the walls. The wood held for now, but if the creatures kept pressing, they could eventually break through. Pete muttered a curse under his breath, and his wife began whispering prayers. I nodded to Lucas to grab the axe. He obeyed, gripping the handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Jim and Enrique stood near the door, holding torches. If the creatures broke through, we would try to fight them off with fire and blows. It wasn't much comfort. The sound stopped. I took a few steps deeper into the room, away from the doors, and whispered to Pete that we needed a plan. Were we just going to sit here until they flushed us out? At that moment, something crashed onto the roof of the barn nearby. The noise reverberated, and we heard horses in the distance snorting nervously before falling silent again. Whatever was happening out there, it was clear the creatures were trying to scare us or lure us outside. Then we heard a distinct growl. Low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't animalistic, but it wasn't human either. The sound came from the left side of the house, and the women screamed. Enrique bolted to the wall, pressing his ear against the boards. A second later, a piercing, high-pitched shriek erupted from the other side. Enrique recoiled, gritting his teeth. We decided to reinforce that side of the house. We dragged an old cabinet and pushed it up against the wall, hoping to make it harder for anything to break through. But a cabinet wasn't a fortress wall. If the creatures wanted in, what would stop them? I stood by the door, watching sparks from the fire outside drift into the fog and vanish. The flames were already dying down, and we were running low on wood. The furniture we'd burned was half gone. Should we add more? We had no choice. Without light, we'd be defenseless. I sent Jim to grab another table. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. He barely stepped out onto the porch when we heard rustling from the right. I shouted for him to come back. Too late. Something low and powerful emerged from the fog. Jim's torch illuminated a massive head with an elongated snout filled with sharp teeth. Its eyes glinted in the faint light. Jim froze, then tried to retreat, but the creature lunged. His scream tore through the air. We rushed toward the door. Enrique ran out with his torch, but saw only the beast dragging Jim into the fog by his shoulder. His scream was cut short, as though choked off. I dashed toward the door with the axe, but it was too late. The fog closed around them, leaving no trace of Jim or the creature. That moment stunned us all. The first human casualty. Jim had been a strong man, working for me for years. Now all that remained of him were his screams, swallowed by the mist. Pete yelled. Shut the door. Lucas yanked Enrique back inside. Enrique, pale and wide-eyed, slammed the door shut and braced it with his shoulder. It's out there, he gasped. Losing someone to the fog shook everyone. The women and children began crying. Pete's sons paced the room, frantic and unsure of what to do. I forced myself to stay composed. Jim was gone, and there was no saving him. But if we let panic take over, we'd all be next. The fire outside was almost out. Without more wood, we'd soon be in complete darkness. Pete suggested barricading the door completely. But if we locked ourselves in without fire, the creatures could dig under the house or break through the walls. The torches wouldn't last long, and we had barely any kerosene left. I forced my thoughts into order and said we needed to bring the fire inside, even if it was just a small one. We dragged the embers onto a metal sheet and added a couple of boards, soaking them in the last of the kerosene. The fire flared up, but weaker than before. Lucas slumped against the wall and closed his eyes. I shook his shoulder, telling him not to give up. Enrique was trembling, muttering, "I couldn't save Jim." I told him it wasn't his fault. There was nothing anyone could have done. Outside, a wet slurping noise mingled with faint guttural sounds. It was hard to tell, but it seemed like the creature was feasting on Jim. The sound broke one of Pete's daughters-in-law out of her stunned silence. She screamed, "They're going to eat us all." I ordered her to be quiet, but my tone came out harsher than I intended. Pete stepped in, calming her down. He promised her he wouldn't let those creatures win. Now we knew for sure. The creatures worked in groups. One had distracted us with the fire and noises while another ambushed Jim. They were either cunning or instinctively clever. Maybe they'd been watching us, waiting for the right moment. Staying in the house felt like inviting the next attack, but going outside was certain death. What could we do? I considered Pete's truck again. Should we risk trying to reach it? But we didn't know exactly where it was, and driving blindly in the fog would be suicidal. Still, staying put only gave the creatures more time to close in. I thought about sending someone out to scout, perhaps with stronger torches, but Enrique refused. Lucas was too shaken, and Pete hesitated. His family needed him. Pete's eldest son was willing, but his hands were trembling. Without proper weapons, we wouldn't stand a chance. I remembered the tool shed, which might still contain stronger implements, iron rods or chains. But as we'd seen before, the fog made reaching it nearly impossible. Time passed, the oppressive silence pressing against our ears. Occasionally we heard footsteps or growls, and sometimes the distant thud of something heavy out on the pasture. The fog's predators roamed freely, doing as they pleased. Pete decided we needed to keep fortifying the house. If we couldn't go outside, we had to make it harder for the creatures to get in. We pushed the remaining furniture against the windows and reinforced the doors as best we could. We dismantled part of the ceiling to create beams for support and plugged gaps. But these were only temporary measures. If the creatures could kill so easily, they would find a way in eventually. The children had stopped crying loudly, and now lay quietly, clutching their mothers. The women prayed softly for salvation. Pete's sons held makeshift spears, their fear evident in their wide eyes. Enrique sat on the floor, staring into the fire. Lucas muttered curses under his breath, gripping the axe tightly. Outside, the world remained a suffocating white void. The fire flickered weakly, and inside the house the air was thick with despair. I approached Pete and whispered, "We need a real plan. If they come back tomorrow, what are we going to do?" Pete stayed silent for a moment before replying, "We can't wait for tomorrow. We need to try to reach the truck tonight, or at least scout the area. With torches and spears. Better to die fighting than sit here waiting to be taken one by one." But we had just lost Jim, snatched right off the porch. Pete clenched his teeth. Now we know they can attack quickly. We need to move as a large group, 5 or 6 of us at least, and stay in a tight circle, each holding a torch and a weapon. We'll try heading in the direction where the road should be. If we find the truck, we'll have a fighting chance. I nodded, though I knew how risky this would be. But he was right. Sitting and waiting was a death sentence. Our supplies were running low, and we'd already lost one of our own. If we did nothing, we'd all die. As we discussed, the scraping sound returned, this time at a window. We froze. The creature was testing the boards as if tasting them. The fire inside burned dimly. We had only 3 torches left, and the kerosene was almost gone. Pete whispered, "We won't survive until morning if they decide to attack all at once." His sons glanced at me nervously. I sighed. Then tonight we make our move. We'll gather all the adult men, take the torches and spears, and try to break through. The women and children will stay inside. We'll either find the truck or distract the creatures." The words felt heavy, leaving our families behind in the house. But we had no choice. If we didn't find weapons or a way out, the end was near. Pete agreed. He was ready to risk his life to save his wife and grandchildren. His sons hesitated but didn't argue with their father. Lucas and Enrique nodded reluctantly. They were terrified but understood that doing nothing was a worse fate. If we didn't try, we'd be picked off one by one. And so we ended that horrific day. With one man lost, fear gripping us, and no clear hope. But with the decision to try and break through. The night felt endless, the fog still an impenetrable barrier. We gathered by the door. Pete, his two grown sons, Lucas, Enrique, and me. Inside, the women and children sat huddled among the makeshift barricades we had built to protect them in our absence. As we prepared to leave, they watched us silently, their eyes pleading, "Come back, bring hope, don't disappear into this pale nightmare." Each of us carried a torch, though the kerosene supply was dangerously low. We tied ourselves together with a rope to avoid getting separated. We armed ourselves with crude spears, wooden sticks with knives tied to their ends. Pete reminded us that the truck wasn't far. The problem was that all landmarks had vanished. During the day, we would have known the truck was parked by the far pen or near the driveway. But now, the fog distorted everything, and every step felt like venturing into the unknown. We opened the door slowly. The embers from the previous fire had already died out. Only our torches provided faint light. Inside, the women sat silently, clutching their children. Pete turned briefly, whispering something that sounded like a goodbye. His sons swallowed hard. I nodded to Lucas and Enrique. They stayed close to me, bracing for whatever might happen. We stepped outside. The air was the same, clammy and cold. The torches flickered, their flames dancing, but they barely illuminated the small circle around us. Our footsteps were muffled. We stayed close, leaving no gaps for anything to slip through. Pete and I led the group, with him trying to recall the direction of the truck. It should have been to the right of the house, slightly further out, near where the road normally ran. We took a few cautious steps. The rope tightened as we moved, keeping us connected. Lucas and Enrique glanced behind frequently, scanning for movement. Occasionally, we heard faint sounds, a distant thud or scrape, but we couldn't tell if they were close or far away. The fog not only concealed but distorted sound. I knew that if we faced one of the creatures head-on, our chances weren't great. But maybe a group of armed men with torches and spears would deter them. Jim had been taken because he was alone on the porch. Now we had 5 men together, surely a more formidable target. At least, that's what I told myself. Minutes passed in tense silence. Pete stopped and lifted his torch. "I think the truck should be around here," he whispered. We took a few more steps. Pete's foot hit something solid. I lowered my torch. It was broken boards from a collapsed fence. There were too many fragments scattered around. Were the creatures destroying the fences to confuse us? Or was this just the aftermath of their hunts? A sharp sound to the left froze us in place. Something rustled and crunched, like branches snapping underfoot. I raised my torch higher. Pete and his sons shifted, holding their spears at the ready. Lucas and Enrique tensed. Visibility was 0. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. We moved forward again, the rope creaking as it kept us tethered. Soon, Pete's torch lit up a dark shape looming ahead. Everyone froze. I crouched closer. It looked like the truck's hood. Sweeping my torch in an arc, I made out the outline of the cab. We'd found it. The truck was tilted. One wheel sunk deep into a hole or rut. Pete's face lit up with a flicker of hope. Quick, the shotgun's in the cab. We crowded around the door. Pete tugged at the handle. It was stuck. He braced himself and pulled harder. The door groaned and gave way. The interior reeked of dampness and something else, like the fog had seeped inside. Pete climbed in while we held the torches outside. He rummaged around and pulled out the shotgun and a box of shells. Finally, a sliver of hope. The shotgun wasn't the ideal weapon against these unknown creatures, but it was better than sticks and knives. Pete loaded the gun, sliding shells into place. I've only got a few shots. I can't miss. We decided to head back to the house. With the shotgun, we might be able to defend ourselves long enough to figure out a plan. Driving into town was still out of the question. We couldn't even find the road. But at least we had something to fight with now. Then we heard it again. This time the sound was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps coming from both the left and right. We froze. Everyone pressed closer together, torches crackling. I strained my eyes into the fog uselessly, but the smell in the air changed, growing sour and sharp. It was the smell of predators drawing near, a deep growl. For a moment, something flickered in front of us. Pete raised the shotgun and fired blindly. The deafening blast echoed in the fog's suffocating silence. For a split second, the flash from the muzzle illuminated the creature's outline, a large, heavy silhouette resembling a warped wolf's body, but larger, with indistinct features. It looked like a smoky beast from a nightmare. The creature leapt back, and we heard a shrill yelp. Pete reloaded, and my heart pounded in my chest. Back to the house, I shouted. We moved along the rope, trying to retrace our steps. But where had we come from? A rustling sound came from behind us. Lucas let out a cry. Turning, I saw Enrique's and Lucas's torches jerking erratically. A creature lunged at Enrique from behind. He swung his torch, and the beast roared and retreated, only for a second one to appear from the opposite side. Enrique struck with his makeshift spear. I couldn't tell if he hit it. The rope snapped and Enrique staggered. I rushed to help, but something barreled into Lucas. He lost his balance, dropping his torch. As he scrambled to pick it up, the beast's jaws clamped down on him. His scream was short and terrifying, and then he was gone, dragged into the fog. The rope jerked and tangled. I yelled. Lucas Pete fired a second shot toward the sound. Another flash, another glimpse of the monsters. There was more than one. They had us surrounded like a pack of wolves. Enrique stumbled toward me, his face twisted in terror. Pete's sons tried to stay close. Pete shouted that we had to go back, but where was the house? We'd lost our bearings. The rope had snapped during the attack, and now we wandered aimlessly in the fog. I held my torch high, searching for any sign of the house. Damn this fog. We were down to one shotgun with only a few shells left, and now Lucas was gone too. Remembering that the house had been roughly behind us, we blindly headed in that direction. The creatures circled us, scraping the ground and growling. We could hear them all around us. Pete fired a third shot, but it was another blind attempt. The deafening sound did nothing to drive them off. I pressed forward, shouting for the others to follow as we swung our torches wildly, trying to scare off the beasts with noise and fire. It barely worked. Finally, we stumbled into the house's outer wall. Thank God we'd found it. We felt our way to the door, which was barricaded from the inside. I yelled for them to open up. Voices answered from within, panicked and frantic. The barricade shifted, and the door creaked open. We tumbled inside, tripping over one another. Pete held the shotgun at the ready. Enrique was half collapsed and Pete's sons were trembling. The women and children stared at us in horror. I raised my torch and glanced around. There were fewer of us now. Lucas hadn't made it back. 2 human lives lost in so little time. Pete gripped the shotgun tightly. There were a few shells left, but we had no idea if he'd killed even one of the creatures. It was clear now. The breakout had failed. We'd found the truck and retrieved the shotgun, but at the cost of Lucas's life. There were multiple predators, and they were intelligent, coordinating their attacks. The house was our only refuge, but how much longer could it hold? I explained what had happened to the others. The women clutched their children, whispering prayers for mercy. Pete wiped his forehead, muttering that staying in the house was suicide, but leaving it was just as fatal. Enrique sat on the floor, a scratch running across his cheek. Pete's sons breathed heavily. From outside, a growl echoed again, followed by another. They knew we were inside. We had the shotgun now. But how many creatures were there? 5, 10, 20? They were fast, strong, and struck from the fog. The fog itself seemed alive, snuffing out light and swallowing sound. We realized that this nightmare wasn't going to end anytime soon. The shotgun was our only hope, but the ammunition was limited. Maybe we could build a larger fire inside, enough to heat the walls and keep them at bay? Burn everything? But that was insanity. We'd suffocate in the smoke. No one spoke of escape anymore. All eyes were on Pete's shotgun, the last thing standing between us and the creatures. Could we force them to retreat? We weren't even sure they felt pain. We'd heard them yelp from a gunshot, but they hadn't left. After a long, heavy silence, someone suggested sealing every crack in the walls and checking the roof. Could they break through the roof? We began reinforcing the house from the inside, scavenging any materials we could find. But we all knew it was only a temporary solution. Losing another person had driven home the horror of our situation. We were trapped, cut off from communication and help. The fog was impenetrable, and the creatures killed quickly and silently. We'd retrieved the shotgun, but it wasn't enough. Food and water were running low. If we didn't find a way out or take a drastic step, death was inevitable. The oppressive silence inside the house was suffocating after Lucas's death. Pete's shotgun lay on the table beside empty cans and the last crumbs of dry bread. Pete sat across from it, head bowed, clutching the weapon like a lifeline in a swamp. Enrique pressed a rag to the scratch on his cheek, while Pete's sons paced the room nervously. The women and children huddled in the corner, their sobs muted, as though they had no tears left to cry. Pete's wife stared blankly at a single spot, her face frozen in despair. We understood now. The fog wasn't going to lift easily. The monsters within it had studied us. They weren't just predators, they were smarter than any animal. No bear or wolf would act so methodically, extinguishing fire, surrounding prey in a thick veil. Still, something had to give eventually. We couldn't stay like this forever. The food and water were nearly gone. The torches were burning out, and there was no more kerosene. If the monsters wanted to draw us out, they only needed to wait until we weakened. Suddenly, a new sound came from outside. It wasn't the usual scraping or growling, it sounded like muffled words or a raspy laugh. I looked at Pete and he stiffened, gripping the shotgun tighter. Pete's sons froze mid-step, and Enrique straightened, ready to grab his makeshift spear. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. It sounded like whispering or the rustling of branches, but the fog never brought anything good. Pete's wife, sitting in the corner, began rocking back and forth, at first slowly, then faster. The children clung to their mothers, who watched her in alarm. Pete tore his gaze from the shotgun and called her name. She didn't respond, as though she couldn't hear him. There was a strange gleam in her eyes, a flicker of madness. It seemed that fear and despair had finally broken her. Before anyone could react, the house shuddered from a heavy blow to the wall. The sound of splintering wood made everyone jump to their feet. I pressed my shoulder against the point of impact, and Pete aimed the shotgun. Through the faint light of the torch, I could only see the murky white fog. But now it felt like the creatures weren't just circling us. They were ready to break in. "Keep your spears ready," I hissed. Pete's sons and Enrique took their positions. Another crash. Splinters rained down, and a narrow crack opened in the wall. I raised my knife, ready to strike. Pete aimed the shotgun. The women screamed and the children sobbed. Pete's wife let out a guttural laugh, as if she had completely lost touch with reality. Through the crack, a clawed paw appeared, long, dark-furred, tipped with sharp talons. We recoiled instinctively. The paw slowly moved along the edge of the hole, as if testing the barrier. Enrique stepped forward, braver than I expected, and jabbed his makeshift spear into it. A guttural growl erupted from outside, and the paw disappeared. Pete fired into the crack, and the muzzle flash briefly illuminated a grotesque wolf-like face, stretched and unnatural. The creature retreated with a pained howl. More sounds erupted, a frenzy of snarling and scraping as more claws tore at the walls from different sides. They were trying to break through the house, and we were trapped inside like caged prey. But now we knew one thing. The shotgun could hurt them. They could feel pain. "Pete, keep your gun trained on the crack," I signaled. "Enrique and the boys, cover him with your spears. I'll try to light a fire near the wall to create a barrier." There were still some rags and scraps of wood scattered on the floor. I lit them with the last flicker of our dying torch, and flames sputtered to life, offering a feeble defense. For a moment, silence fell. It seemed like the creatures were rethinking their approach. Then one of Pete's sons shouted, "Look through the crack!" We saw the full silhouette of one of them, a tall humanoid figure covered in dense fur. Its elongated muzzle, pointed ears, and glowing yellow eyes marked it as something far worse than an ordinary animal. A wolf-like werewolf. And there wasn't just one. We could see the faint movements of at least 2 or 3 others. Pete froze, shaken by the sight of these monstrous creatures. I swallowed hard. These weren't just animals. They were monsters, half human and half beast. They attacked from the shadows, using the fog like a weapon. Perhaps they even summoned it. But if one had been injured, maybe we could fight back. One of the werewolves dared to push its snout through the crack. Pete fired, and it retreated with a pained yelp. We heard its frantic footsteps retreating. Another tried to breach the door. Enrique jabbed it with his spear, and Pete's sons struck at the walls with their clubs, trying to fend them off. I added more rags to the fire, the flames licking at the damp air. From the corner of the room, Pete's wife let out a wild laugh. She stood up, her eyes blazing with madness. Pete gestured for her to sit, but she darted toward the wall, shouting incoherently. Before we could stop her, she lunged for the door and tried to unbolt it, as if inviting the beasts inside. "Get back," Pete yelled, but she didn't listen. She tore at the barricade as one of the creatures slammed against the door. The boards groaned and splintered. Claws shot through the opening and grabbed her clothing. Without hesitation, Pete rushed forward and fired point-blank at the werewolf. The beast howled and recoiled. Enrique and I pulled Pete's wife away from the door, but at that moment, another werewolf found a weak spot. Boards on the left wall cracked apart, and a dark figure forced its way inside, baring its fangs. Pete's son charged at it with a spear, but the werewolf dodged and slashed his arm with its claws, drawing a scream of agony. Pete fumbled to reload the shotgun, but his trembling fingers dropped the shells. The second son lunged with his spear, stabbing the creature in the side. The werewolf snarled and pounced on Pete. Pete stumbled over a chair and fell, the beast pinning him down. Its jaws tore into his chest, ripping through flesh and cloth. His scream was raw and desperate. We attacked the creature from all sides. Enrique with his knife, me with a wooden club, Pete's sons with whatever they could grab. The werewolf thrashed and roared, its strength overwhelming. Pete's blood pooled beneath him. I shoved a burning rag into the creature's face. Its fur singed and it howled, loosening its grip. One of Pete's sons, in a rage, drove a knife into its neck. Blood sprayed as the creature convulsed, then scrambled back out through the hole, leaving tufts of fur and a trail of blood behind. Pete lay motionless on the floor. His wife screamed, laughing and crying hysterically. I knelt beside him and pressed a hand to his chest, but there was no heartbeat. He was gone. Another life lost. Pete's sons wept bitterly, but there was no time for mourning. The werewolves outside howled in unison. They must have seen that one of their own was badly injured or killed. Their sounds grew fainter as they retreated. We could still hear their footsteps and growls, but they were no longer as close. Enrique raised his torch and peered through the crack. The silhouettes were moving away, retreating into the fog. Perhaps they realized we could fight back. Pete's wife curled up in the corner, clutching her head and muttering incoherently. The children stared in terrified silence, and the women held them tightly, whispering soft reassurances. Pete's sons knelt beside their father's body, their grief palpable. I leaned against the wall, wiping sweat and blood from my face. Minutes passed. The sounds outside faded. I peered through one of the cracks, seeing nothing but fog. But it seemed lighter now, less oppressive, as if whatever force held it here was beginning to weaken. We waited a little longer. No more crashes, no more growls or footsteps, only a faint breeze, the first we'd felt in days. Enrique looked up at the ceiling, where faint light began to filter through the thinning fog. I cracked the door open. Outside, the white veil was lifting. The fence, the trees, the barn, familiar shapes emerged through the haze. The fog was dissipating, as if the force holding it in place had let go. We stepped onto the porch. The ground was wet, littered with blood, fur, and the scars of our battle. The monsters were gone, either retreating into the forest or vanishing with the mist. All that remained was us, battered, terrified, and grieving. Inside, Pete's wife rocked back and forth, lost to madness. Without Pete, her future would be bleak, but we would do our best to care for her and the children. Pete's sons sat by his body, staring silently at the familiar landscape returning through the lifting fog. Enrique and I stood on the porch, unsure if this was truly the end. The creatures had fled and the fog was fading. The sun was just below the horizon, its light breaking through. We had survived, but at a steep cost. Jim, Lucas, and now Pete were dead. Pete's wife was broken. We didn't know what those creatures were, where they came from, or why the fog had come and gone. Perhaps it was a curse, an anomaly, or something beyond comprehension. The fog had lifted, but it left scars on our souls. Among the charred wood, spent shells, and bloodstains, we stood, listening to the faint sound of birds returning with the dawn. Life might go on, but it would never be the same. The ranch could be rebuilt, but the memory of the fog and the monsters would haunt us. And as I looked out over the clearing horizon, I couldn't help but wonder if the fog might one day return. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in a year, or maybe never.